So all we did was we took a little step out to manage our drop-down list. Now we're back into Find Fields, where I can now go and edit user 1 and make that my referred by details field in order to get my database a little bit started. So I'm going to double-click. In order to edit a field, you can highlight it and choose Edit Fields, or I can double-click on the field in order to get in there, which is more often the way that I like to do that. So to edit a field, you've got a few limitations here. If you're editing one of the user fields, they start off as character fields. We talked about field types a little bit when we were looking at drop-downs. When you're working with fields, though, there are a lot more options that you have. That being said, if you're going to be editing a field, you're limited a little bit to where the data can convert to. So this field originally was a character field, and I can turn it into an annual event field, a currency field, date, date time, decimal, initial caps, lowercase, memo, number, time, uppercase, and URL address. So there's a lot I can turn it into. A few exceptions to this is I can't convert a basic character field into an email address field. So if I wanted to track 4 or 5 emails in the database, I'd need to make a brand new field. I can't just reuse one of the user fields. Also, if I wanted to add an address block to the database, let's say I've got my main address and I've got my home address, but I wanted to add an alternate address, I'd have to start from scratch. I can't convert one of these user fields to that. In this case, though, because we're doing referred by details, that is a character field. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename it. When it comes to naming your fields, a couple of things to be mindful of. Spaces are okay, and underscores are okay. Dashes, I believe, are also okay. I don't like using these slashes. ACT does in some of their primary fields, like ID status does have a slash between them. But moving forward, we don't recommend using special characters in the field name definition. Just stick with spaces and underscores, really. Those are kind of the two that we as consultants use. We don't even use hyphens that much, just spaces and underscores. Just to keep it nice and clean, the database will like you more, I promise you that. You can select the data type that you're going to be functioning with. So again, I mentioned since I'm editing a field, I'm a little bit more limited. We're going to be making a brand new address block, and I'll show you how to choose that. But it's good to also think through what kind of information am I tracking. In this case, referred by details we already talked about. It's just going to be character. I'm typing in names and companies and things like that. Special characters are fine once you actually enter in the data. But if I were doing if I wanted to track currency, I should select currency. If I needed a date field, I should select the date field. So I want that information to be defined from the very beginning, just to have, again, clean foundation. So think through a little bit, what information am I tracking, and choose the appropriate field. If you're not sure, leave it as character. This is the most flexible of the field types. All right, we have some field behaviors that we can function, that we can customize. Allow blank means this field can accept empty values. If this is unchecked, it means that it is a mandatory field, and before you can move off that contact or even delete that contact if you accidentally create a duplicate, you have to fill in that data. I don't like making many fields mandatory. I think, strategically you may think, oh yeah, I need to demand a company and a contact and a phone because that's what we build our business on. And I can appreciate that, but if you've marked company, contact, phone, address, one, city, state, zip, all of that mandatory, if you accidentally create a contact and you need to go and delete that contact, that you have to put in data into all of those fields before you'll be able to even move off the contact and actually get back to work. So it can be a bit of a headache. The other thing is there are times that people won't give you that information or they won't even have it. There are a lot of contacts that don't have company names. They're sole proprietors and they are their company. So if you were to make company a mandatory field, it wouldn't always make sense. So typically, ID status is one field we do like to make mandatory. Other than that, though, we don't really recommend using mandatory very much. So in this case, absolutely referred by details, we're going to allow blank. I don't always know where people are coming from. And sometimes I don't really care. With vendors and personal contacts, I don't need to track the referred by details on that contact. I want that there for when I need it. So I'm going to leave this as allow blank. Generate history. You can turn on this option if you want to track the changes made to particular fields. This probably isn't a great example of a field to do that on. ID status, perhaps. Every time I change the ID status, I want to record a history. And that history that gets recorded says, this field was changed, it used to be this value, and now it's this value. And that can be helpful, again, in a multi-user environment. You want to see how data is getting updated. I don't like this as well for all fields. I don't really care if somebody's address to line gets changed. But, again, be strategic about when you want to use this or not. Primary fields, if it's a key field, when I make a duplicate of the data, I want that data to copy over. I can select it as a primary field. And then lastly, we've got use drop-down list. And I'm going to enable that, which gives me a drop-down of our drop-down lists. And this is why I like to go and make and edit those drop-downs before. So now when I go through my drop-down list, I can see referred by details listed here because we already created it. So I'm selecting referred by details. I'm using a drop-down list. I'm going to use this particular drop-down list. If you get to this point in your database design and you realize, oh, shoot, I forgot to add my drop-down, that's fine. Just leave it unchecked. Finish your design, go make the drop-down, and come back and edit it and just turn that on. I wouldn't cancel everything you've done so far, naming the field and selecting the type, all of that. I'd just keep it and just come back in and change it later. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to select my drop-down list and hit Next. This next screen is only available if you have used a drop-down. So we can customize our field and list behavior. If you don't have a drop-down on a field, this won't ever show up. You'll move on to the next screen, and we'll get there shortly. But when you are working with drop-downs, you have a little bit more control. I mentioned one of the securities you have with drop-downs is earlier, we can limit whether users are able to edit the list or not. So if you're trying to categorize your contacts into 4 categories, and so everyone has to fit into one of those 4, that's an example of how I might not let people edit the list, because I've defined my 4 contacts, my 4 drop-down categories, and I don't want that to get changed. You can also limit it. They may be able to edit, but you can say, I only want you to be able to select values from the drop-down. This is nice because it kind of enforces that people will use the drop-down, and it'll help with spelling errors. Referred by details, though, because it's such a specific field, I'm going to uncheck this option. I don't want to limit to the list for this kind of information. It's a little bit lower on the reporting level. I don't really care if people spell things differently, but I'm not going to force myself to limit to list. If I did, before I could use a value that wasn't on the dropdown, I'd have to add it to the dropdown and then be able to select it. Allow multi-select. If you want options, just like we have little checkboxes here, if you want to be able to multi-select on a particular field, you can turn that on at this point. By leaving it off, it only allows people to select one value from the drop-down menu. So for this case, again, I'm going to leave it unchecked, and we'll come back and we'll look at the examples now in our database once we finish this. Showing descriptions, if you have descriptions in your drop-down, a lot of times if people have some sort of a rating scale, they'll have A means, 10,000 to 100,000, B means 5,000 to 10,000, that sort of a thing, where you want to explain what the value of the drop-down is but not actually have it. In your data, you can show descriptions. My referred by details doesn't use descriptions, so I'm going to turn this off. And then lastly, we have enable type ahead. I love type ahead. If I type A, alphabet comes up. If I type B, it tries to guess. As the more I type, the more it drills down. I just like leaving this on. For me, it's really useful. So I'm going to go ahead and enable type ahead. We're going to hit next, and we're going to get some more basic field behavior customizations. If you've got a field and you want to add a default value, every time I create a record, this should be filled in. Then there's the field length, and field length is kind of the last big thing we have to analyze when designing our database. You want the field long enough to account for the largest value you'll put in, but not too long to take up a bunch of space. I think even when you make a new field, the default is 50. If you're only putting in things like open and closed, and that's the only value that will end up in a field, or even yes or no, and possibly maybe, your field length should be 10 characters or less. Yes, no, and maybe. If you're picking one of the three, it's going to be 5 characters at most. So I would definitely recommend keeping the field length as small as possible.